Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to Merryn Talks Money, the podcast in which people who know the markets explain the markets. I'm Merryn Somerset Webb. Now, this week we are focusing on a topic that you know John and I are both very interested in. Nuclear power and what role it will play or should play in our future energy systems. We talk about this a lot on this show as we push ourselves towards a world where we hope to see better economic growth, better productivity, and as the use of energy-intensive technologies such as AI increase, our need for a better, more efficient, more secure energy supply is only growing. So when we think about more energy, we really do have to think very carefully about where it is going to come from. According to a report from the World Nuclear Association, electricity demand is now increasing about twice as fast as overall energy use and is going to increase by a good 50%, possibly, between now and 2040. So almost all reports on future energy supply from all major organizations suggest that we do have to think about an increasing role for nuclear energy. So here to help us unpack what the world looks like now, what it will look like or should look like, and what that means for your portfolio, we have two brilliant guests. We have Jake Jurewicz, co-founder and CEO of Blue Energy. Blue Energy is commercializing an innovative modular reactor agnostic power plant architecture to house the next generation of nuclear reactors. Now, we definitely have to unpack that bit. And we have Nick Lawson, who we have spoken to before, is CEO and co-founder of Ocean Wall, which has three businesses: corporate advisory, investment, and research. Nick has 25 years of experience in finance and is particularly interested in niche alternative investment opportunities. And one of the things he is most interested right now, and he and I talk about a reasonable amount, is nuclear energy. Nick, Jake, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Lovely to be here, Merryn. And hi, Jake.
Hey, good to see you again, Nick.
Right. Nick and Jake know each other already, which is extremely useful. Right. What we want to do is we want to set the scene here. So, Nick, let me ask you, can you lay out for us, as simply as possible, the case for nuclear energy in our changing energy world? I mean, I suppose the key thing to start with here is just to say that abundant energy is the key to pretty much everything. We talk a lot here about how all economic activity is energy transformed. So the more abundant we can make the energy that we survive on and the cheaper we can make it, the better. So how can we make the case for nuclear in that context?
I think the point you made at the start, Merryn, of the technological needs. I mean, the demand now on a single request through an AI chat consumes 2.9 watt hours. Now, that's 10 times more than a Google search. Now, we as a country 10 years ago would have about 14% of our power come from nuclear. It's now about a little bit less than that. But the reason there is a need for it is that stable and continuous energy source, and that's crucial. And although I'm a big fan of wind and solar, the intermittency is the issue. Now, the thing with nuclear is there's no greenhouse gas emissions. So compared to fossil fuels, it's a big plus there for combating climate change. But I'd say in this very fragile world with so much geopolitical risk, nuclear power offers domestically controlled energy. I mean, we're a big net importer now, particularly from Norway and France, of energy. And this allows us that element of national energy security. Also the safety issue. I know people often conflate nuclear energy with nuclear weapons. And obviously the memories of things like Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island, Fukushima still exist. But it is an incredibly safe, efficient, viable form of power. And also at the same time, for the UK, it drives technological innovation. I mean, we have a company in Rolls-Royce and other SMR developers really pushing forward to advance nuclear technologies, which will be good in terms of jobs, innovation, and within their overall UK supply chain. So I think for the UK's long-term sustainability, nuclear is the only answer.
All right, let's just unpack a little bit around the use of renewables and low carbon energy sources. You say that you're not against wind and solar, great. But the advantage that nuclear has over that, as I understand it, is that A, it's not intermittent, and B, it can be nuclear plants, but whether they be big or small, can be constructed where energy is required. So one of the big problems with solar, which is mainly in the southwest of the UK, I'm just looking at the UK at the moment, and wind, which is mainly in the very north of the UK, is it not only is intermittent, but it's far away from the areas where electricity demand is the highest. And our grid is designed originally to receive energy from a few large power plants relatively close to where energy is required, right? So renewables come with two problems: distance and intermittency. I can see Jake wanting to interrupt there. Jake.
I'll add to that. I like wind and solar for a lot of use cases, but in addition to the reality that you have to build them where the wind is, where the sun shines, and it's intermittent, it's not producing 24/7, 365, which you need for a modern economy. It's also low density, which means it just consumes a lot of land. You need a lot of acreage to put down a lot of solar panels, a lot of wind turbines, particularly in an increasingly advancing, modernizing economy where we're inventing new ways to consume power, like large language models, data centers, but also as we deal with climate resiliency and the increasing installation of air conditioning and electrification of space heating, electrification of industrial loads. We need a lot of power in a growing economy, and we have to be very thoughtful about our use of land. You need a lot of land to put down a lot of wind turbines and solar panels. You also need a lot of land to connect all the transmission and batteries required to harden that intermittent generation. So it kind of balloons some of the infrastructure costs and balloons some of the space requirements to be entirely reliant upon wind and solar.
Yeah, and it's one of the big conversations in the UK at the moment is that cost of infrastructure and the problems of building new pylons in particular and new substations. And I was speaking to anecdotal, but to friends the other day who suddenly find that having bought a nice house in the country, they're about to be surrounded by pylons, which was a surprise because until recently, that is not something that most people would have considered to be a major risk when they buy an isolated farmhouse, for example.
I don't mind pylons. I always think of the Ted Hughes poem Iron Man when I see them now. I actually quite like them.
I'll let them know there's an available buyer for their house.
Well, I shot the other day at someone's estate, and apparently to bury a pylon costs just shy of £1 million.
Well, it's not just burying them. The cost is later to, if they need fixing, you got to dig them up. So it's an awful lot more efficient to have them above ground, even if it is uglier. And obviously some people believe it leads to health concerns. We are getting sidetracked. So what nuclear does is it solves for all these problems. It solves for the intermittency and it solves for the distance. It solves in large part, not completely, for the infrastructure problem and the need to build out a grid in a very expensive way. So it solves for those problems. But many would say that it comes with its own problems. There is, as you said, Nick, a lot of concern about safety, although I think we do know if we look at the numbers that it's one of the safest ways of generating electricity in terms of actual deaths, right? Is that fair?
Absolutely right. The big issue back in the 1950s when you had Heysham and Hartlepool and the big reactors getting built was the Nimi issue. People really didn't want them. And now if you go back to the sites of where the old British Energy fleet is, even Sizewell, the benefit has been huge. I mean, you've got the movement of brilliant people to the area. But again, it becomes a legacy thing. Now what we have is these sites with the permissioning on them where we can add these small modular reactors. The issue in the UK is we have 7 bodies that effectively are responsible for making a decision on Britain's nuclear policy. It's nuts. Now, I gave evidence to the Energy Select Committee last year around the decarbonisation of power white paper. And, they listen and they hear, but there's very little action. I feel very worried. And Luke and I, when we were at this dinner recently, the representatives from the National Grid spoke and said, there's no point us thinking about having an AI strategy when we can't supply domestic households. Now, there was a power surge in January of this year where power hit £6,000 a megawatt hour. And we are reliant on Norway for the import of power. We have the lack of, whether it's government guidance, but we just do not have the infrastructure to supply our domestic needs, let alone those of a data center. Now, Microsoft's Stargate data center, which is a 5 gigawatt data center, that takes down the power of 5 New York boroughs. 5 New York boroughs, 24/7 for 1 5 gigawatt Stargate center, and that's going to be around 8% of their total data center needs. So you need to have this kind of capacity, and you're seeing now deals like Microsoft buying 3 Mile Island That's 819 megawatts. They're buying these data themselves. So you're going to have this issue that's going to take place where who do you prioritize? It will become an issue of moral turpitude if you're not supplying your households, but you are allowing Microsoft to run a giant data center.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there was, I don't know if you saw a little while back, there was some mutterings in the EU about banning or limiting AI and limiting the building and use of data centers specifically because of the energy use. And it's dangerous stuff to talk about in the UK because next thing you know, Ed Miliband will be out there banning data centers.
This is one of the things that kind of frustrates me is like since the 1970s and the oil embargo, there's been this big movement of energy efficiency. And energy efficiency has been great for increasing the productivity of certain technologies like refrigerators in your home. But it's gotten a little too far in the minds, I think, of certain politicians where they think, oh, we should just energy efficiency our way out of this climate challenge, out of this energy consumption challenge. People start to conflate the idea of, oh, consuming more energy is bad. And that's just a flawed way of thinking. There's many countries around the world that are just now installing air conditioning, refrigeration for food, putting in hospitals, putting in modern infrastructure, like base standard of living requirements that are going to increase their energy intensity per capita from developing nation levels just to European levels, which are half of the energy consumption per capita of the United States or Canada. Who are we to say that they shouldn't consume energy? And let's look at ourselves. The UK needs to continue to grow its economy. Europe needs to continue to grow its economy. It can't afford to fall behind on key technologies like AI. It can't afford to not electrify transportation, industry, chemical synthesis. All the new capabilities that are coming out from our universities and labs, are we going to say that we should not invest in that infrastructure? Are we going to start turning off people's hot showers? No, we have the technology, we have the capability to build an energy supply infrastructure that is both zero carbon and affordable and reliable enough to meet the expectations that we've grown accustomed to over the last 100 years. So I get very frustrated when I hear this rhetoric of, oh, we should cut things off because they consume too much energy. Water desalination consumes a lot of energy. Should we not have clean water?
Yeah. So we should celebrate increasing energy use because with increasing energy use comes economic growth and improved lifestyles. So we should celebrate it and find a way to make it work, right?
Absolutely.
Jake, let's talk about what you do. When I described it in the introduction, completely incomprehensible, accurate, but incomprehensible. So will you explain to us what your product is, how it works?
Yeah, actually, I'll describe it in very simple terms. What we're doing is designing a modular plant architecture that is compatible with multiple nuclear reactor vendors. That allows us to basically cut the costs and cut the deployment time roughly in half. And the way that we're doing that is that we're designing the plant so it can be entirely prefabricated in offshore oil and gas fab yards, offshore wind fab yards, and shipyards from around the north of Britain, northern Europe, and other facilities around the world. The advantage is, for the same reason, a prefabricated home can be built on a more predictable cost schedule and at a lower price and on a faster schedule than a stick-built home on site. We're just taking advantage of the big factories that already exist that have done this for large energy infrastructure before, particularly for North Sea oil and offshore wind. A little known fact about nuclear power, if you look at Hinkley Point C or Flamanville, Okoloto, Vogtle, or any other major nuclear plant that's been built in the last 40 to 50 years in the West, only about 7% of the cost of that plant is the actual nuclear reactor. 93% of the cost of building a nuclear plant is the accrued interest on debt because it takes so long to build it, usually about 10 to 15 years. And it's the construction overhead. It's the cost of training and relocating about 10,000 skilled workers to a place like Hinkley Point and hosting them and their families, retaining them, mobilizing large 1,000-ton cranes, putting in performance bonds, contingency, the litigation that happens between trades. It's all that overhead. And it's the same overhead that occurs when you try and build a big international airport or other big civil infrastructure projects. So if we're trying to make nuclear look less like building a big international airport and more like buying an Airbus A340, we can do that using the existing supply chain from offshore wind and offshore oil and gas, using the existing labor force that is already skilled and trained to do heavy steel fabrication. So we've designed the plant to minimize the amount of what's called kind of nuclear QA, nuclear grade work, so that we can have most of it done by the labor that's already trained. There's a big labor challenge for building nuclear and for building a lot of large infrastructure around the West. So part of the exercise here is thinking about how to best leverage the supply chain and the labor resources we do have so that we can go faster. It's critical that we think about how to move quickly on deploying new nuclear. If we were to start Hinkley Point C, today, we wouldn't, and we built it the same way, we wouldn't be seeing the power come online until maybe 2040. And that is just too far for most companies to make investment decisions. The Microsofts, Googles, Amazons of the world who are thinking about where to put AI data centers, they're making shorter timescale decisions. They need power sooner. Governments even need to make decisions sooner. So the way that we're designing this plant is specifically to attract project finance so that commercial banks can get back into the business of investing in nuclear power infrastructure instead of relying on government subsidies, which has been the process to date and tends to be very slow.
Okay, so you can make one of these things in Aberdeen, something like that, and ship it out to wherever it needs to go.
Yep, that's the idea.
How much space does it require, and how much power does it provide?
So the reactors we're working with can range in size from approximately 7 to 7 megawatts to 300 megawatts per reactor per unit. Each unit takes up approximately 2 to 3 acres when you take into account the full system, the steam plant, the balancer plant, the switch yard. So it's a very space efficient, very power dense way to produce power. We are designing it so that it can tuck into places along the coast, rivers, lakes, canals, or go further offshore, out of sight, out of mind, over the horizon line. Most of our design is below the water line. So you don't have a large 200-meter mast sticking above the horizon line, taking up your whole view shed. If you own some property on the coastline and you're looking out to sea, we're designing it to blend into the environment.
Okay. Just to remind everybody, because we're not talking to an expert audience here, the reason that all these plants are on the water is because the water is used for cooling. So they're automatically on a lake, on the sea, etc.
Well, yeah, particularly in the UK, the UK is an island, so a lot of the power plants are along the coast. We like to have water for cooling the condenser. So yeah, it's used for cooling.
Okay, and price-wise, the Hinkley is costing us, 34 billion or something after being 10 years late and 7,000 changes, etc. That's the kind of price point we'd really, really like to avoid, all of us, everywhere, isn't it?
Yeah, I think 34 billion and growing. We don't know what the final number is until it's all said and done. It's just not a sustainable number for any sort of financing for anybody to kind of bite off. It's even challenging for the government to do it. You're getting basically a negotiation between the UK government and the French government to try to figure out how to get that thing financed. What we're doing is designing a plant where you can build a unit for on the order of about $500 million, so far less than $1 billion, which enables private sources of capital to come in and finance it.
Okay, well, this sounds absolutely fantastic. When can we have them? We'd like one outside every small town in the UK immediately. When's the first one going up and where?
We're targeting a commercial operation for our first unit of 2031. We've specifically chosen a site where it can have a more accelerated path to permitting. I would say permitting and regulation that Nick brought up earlier is probably the main source of friction for moving faster. If we had a more streamlined permitting process for nuclear, not just in the UK, but other parts of the world, we could deploy it much more quickly using this supply chain method that we're pursuing with Blue Energy. So 2031, we're in discussions about possibly pulling that forward a couple of years with an AI data center partner who has a lot of appetite for power. And then once the first one's online, everybody wants to be in line for the second. So it's very quick to scale after that.
Okay, so it really is the AI providers who are transformational in the space, isn't it? They're the ones who are going to provide the finance to get this kicked off. And once the first couple are up, every other industry and every government is going to go, wow, why didn't we do this before? I'll have one of those too. And then, Nick, we run into a problem, don't we? Because everyone's going to want the same bit of uranium.
Correct. And that's sort of the premise of our thesis for the last 5 years. What Jake was saying about the timeline, I mean, it's the same for Bill Gates and Sam Altman with their SMR designs. But a lot of this is permissioning, as Jake says. I mean, Russia already has a floating small modular reactor, academic Lomonov's, which provides energy for remote locations. The Chinese also have them as well. The issue now is the size of not just the small modular reactors, but to have the sort of 1+ gigawatt reactors. And all these require fuel. That fuel is uranium. Uranium is the only input to a nuclear fuel rod. And I often give analogies to people that it's a little bit like a glass of water. What price would you pay for a glass of water now? Well, probably £1. What price would you pay in a week if you hadn't had any? Well, all your wealth, and you'll probably kill me and everyone around you to achieve it. And that inelasticity that exists within uranium means that if a power plant doesn't have uranium, they have to shutter. And that shuttering can take years to restart. But also, it costs in excess of $1 million a day. But the most important issue is, and particularly in areas like the US, where 1 in 4 households on the western seaboard take power from nuclear, is societal unrest. If you turn off a nuclear power station, it doesn't take much in the US to get people on the streets with guns anyway. But, we saw in 2006 the price of uranium spike 7 times in 6 months. And that was at a time when you had half the world was against nuclear. You didn't have iPhones or AI data centers. And the price, because fuel buyers will pay anything, and I mean anything, because the input of the fuel in the overall cost of a nuclear power plant is between 3 and 5%, which means they will pay anything to secure the fuel. The issue we miss in the West is this whole idea of the inelasticity of demand, but also the issue of supply. There is one country that is responsible for 40% of the output, and that is Kazakhstan. And that effectively makes it, in uranium terms, the equivalent of OPEC plus. One country, and that country is bordered by 2 other countries, Kazakhstan, Russia to the north and China to the east. And if you look at the history of Kazakhstan, it never had its colored revolution from Russia. I won't use the word apparatchik, but if you look at the way in which the fuel riots took place in 2022 in Astana, they were quelled by Russian paratroopers. We study trade data that comes out of Kazakhstan, and 80% of their uranium exports in the last quarter went to Russia and China. We are seeing a bifurcation of supply from the world's biggest producer away from the West and to the East. We study and track all the state visits that take place. President Xi's first trip after COVID was to see President Tokayev of Kazakhstan. When Macron took Framatome and Urano out to Astana to meet President Tokayev last November, who turned up the following week? Putin. This is the hottest person at the disco, Kazakhstan, and everyone wants them. Now, if you can't, the only way in which uranium moves properly out of Kazakhstan is through Russia. So peats on the Baltic, and then it goes out. We've looked at other routes to see if it can move out through the east. It can't through China. And whether it can move through the Caspian Sea, the Black Sea, and the Bosphorus, it's almost impossible to do. So Putin owns all the cards in this trade at the moment. And Russia has been pioneering uranium enrichment using gas centrifuges since the 60s. They're responsible for 50% of the world's enrichment. So you take the fuel out of the ground in Kazakhstan as the oxide, then you have to turn it into a gas, then you turn it into the pellets that go into the fuel rods. That is done by Russia.
But not only Russia, Nick, because you say 40% comes from Kazakhstan. Where's the other 60%? I mean, Canada, right? We like Canada.
Yeah, well, it's really good. If you look at the world, so Russia have a policy called Near and Beyond, very similar to the Wings Belt and Road Initiative in China, which is to take control of people that have, or to go in, build the plants, run the plants, fuel the plants in countries that mine the uranium. So if you look at the coups that have gone from West to East Africa, Niger is the 4th biggest producer of uranium. That now is under coup d'etat, and the French have been kicked out and the Russians are now in there. If you look at the other big producer, Namibia is really controlled by China through the Wings program. The other biggest producer is Uzbekistan. So you can get a picture. Now, yes, Canada is a producer of uranium. They have the Athabasca Basin in Saskatchewan. It produces 12% of the world's uranium. But to give you an example, we financed the company that discovered uranium in 2010. They get it out of the ground in 2032. because everything in uranium, exactly the same as what Jake was saying around building plants, is glacial. Everything is glacial. Nothing moves quickly. And so the idea of being able to ramp up production in uranium is just impossible. So uranium has gone up 3 times in the last 4 years, and the supply response, it's gone down. Now, what other commodity can you think of where the supply response to a tripling in the price is going down? I think the price of uranium could be moving so exponentially that there will have to be almost like a force majeure from governments, and that won't stop the price going higher.
My worry here is that one of the things that we started talking about was energy security and how we don't really get much of that from renewables, and we certainly don't get much of it from fossil fuels, given we refuse to explore and produce our own. But I had thought that maybe nuclear was a place we could get a little energy security from, but from what you say, absolutely not.
Not. So the advice I gave to the government, and I still give to the government because I advise the Treasury and number 10, is the idea of having our own sort of sequestering vehicle for uranium. Now, we are very fortunate that with Urenco, we have enrichment facilities in the UK, and they do exist, but it's not the amount of the levels of enrichment that we need. And there's a fundamental reason for this, is that after 1993, when Yeltsin and Bush signed the megatons to megawatts program, this was the idea of the downblending of Russian weapons-grade uranium to be sold as an energy source. The world became hooked on cheap, downblended Russian uranium, which meant that they stopped investing in their own centrifuges and enrichment facilities. And so by dint of that, we don't have them. So Russia controls that game. So there is only one operational conversion facility in the US, that's in New Mexico, and it's run by Urenco.
Right. We've really got to stop getting hooked on Russian gear, haven't we?
We have to.
Jake, are you worried about the supply of uranium to your plant?
Yeah, I guess I want to add a few things here because I don't want to paint an inaccurate or overly pessimistic picture. I got to work with one of the largest nuclear fuel procurement teams at Exelon when I was there on the corporate strategy team for 6 years. Exelon owned, well, now Constellation owns about, I think it's 22, 23 reactors in the U.S. They buy more nuclear fuel than pretty much anybody, and we would buy it pretty far out in the future as a part of the supply chain. Uranium has not been a huge concern, largely because there are major uranium supplies in the U.S., in Canada, and Australia, and not just in Kazakhstan. It's just that it's been such a steady state supply and demand that there hasn't been a lot of investment in new supply, and over the years, the supply has just slowly shuttered. If the price really spiked, just like anything, you'd see a lot of new supply come online in uranium mining, conversion capacity, enrichment.
But Jake, I hear what you're saying, but a uranium mine is not like you don't take it out of mothball and restart it. The inflationary break-even cost of restarting a US mine is around $90 a pound. But then you've got to go through the permissioning. I mean, the US mine 500,000 pounds of uranium a year. Their global need is 50 million. You know, it's almost impossible. And all the rigs that were used in Wyoming and Utah have all moved to oil and gas. The people, the geologists, the scientists, they've all disappeared. You can't. It sounds so obvious to restart production, but it's impossible to do in actual effect.
I fully disagree. I completely disagree.
Why do you disagree? Why do you disagree? Tell me a mine that you can restart now.
Well, so mining uranium isn't like mining most things. And that's because like a lot of people think about, it's a fuel, like it's like coal or like gas. And they think about roughly the ratio of how much of it you need. You need to feed a lot of coal, a lot of gas, a lot of other kind of matter into these types of energy production. For nuclear is about 100 million times more energy dense per unit mass than anything else. You don't need very much uranium to make a megawatt hour, which means that you can actually, it's valuable to pull uranium out of extremely dilute sources. You can extract uranium out of seawater.
How much does that cost?
The Japanese have shown you can do this for about $400 a kilogram.
$400 a kilogram. So $400 a kilogram, what's the price at the moment? It's $63 a pound.
Yep,
the cost of extraction from seawater. So that means the price of uranium is going to have to absolutely roar to make the extraction costs from seawater.
But isn't that part of your point? Isn't that part of your point? It doesn't matter if it roars because it's such a tiny part of the process that it
Correct.
Doesn't matter if your uranium costs you $400. It's just a matter of, is there uranium out there that we can get to keep the plants rolling?
I'm going to play the expert here. To uranium, in terms of the world needs 200 million pounds as it stands at the moment of oxide. When you mine uranium at 150 meters below ground, it has non-conformity. It's a bit like a pearl necklace with different sized pearls. The absolute amounts are tiny. The way in which geologists find it is they look for radioactive samples in small boulders and they triangulate them from where they would have moved from the thawing of the last ice age 10,000 years ago. They then have to vector into very, very, very specific areas to find those seams. Now, there's two big seams radioactive seams that run through the Athabasca Basin. Then the timing of being able to extract it, permissioning from indigenous people, finding the geologists, the cost of the rigs, everything about it has to have a break-even price to know that you can sell that uranium at a future point in time of $90 a pound. The current price is $65. So we're now at a point where no one is going to restart. If you wanted to restart any mine in the world, it's going to take you 4 to 5 years of permissioning from an existing site. We're brokers to Uranium Energy Corporation, who are the biggest US producer at the moment. They are waiting. They sit on pounds and they're waiting. Of course they're waiting because they have to be contracted at something north of 100 to make it economically viable.
Okay, so I think we can agree on one thing, which is that uranium price will probably go up. Okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so we can disagree about how the supply-demand imbalance may or may not be solved over the next 5 to 10 years, but we can agree that in the short to medium term, we would expect to see the uranium price rise significantly. And we can also agree that that shouldn't make any difference to the ongoing process of producing SMRs and bumping up the production of nuclear energy globally. Is that fair?
I'm going to say one thing. I think the issue that we're seeing with Bill Gates and Sam Altman securing the fuel, as Jake said, is because when they started modeling the cost of small modular reactors back in 2016, 2017, the cost of enriched uranium was around $6,000 a kilogram. Their IRR was around 14 to 15%. It's now $32,000 a kilogram, which means their IRR is zero. They need to find a way to secure enriched uranium at a cost that brings the IRRs back up to where they were when they started modeling small modular reactors.
Jake, anything that we've missed, do you think that you would like to add to this conversation?
As a species, we need to figure out how to come to grips with nuclear power. Pretty much every power source in the universe ultimately stems from nuclear. Wind and solar are just indirect ways of extracting nuclear energy from the sun. I think if we're going to embrace this future of energy abundance, not just for AI, but for any other innovation that we're going to drive forward in our economy, we've got to figure out how to build more nuclear power and how to build out the supply chain for nuclear power. Fuel included, labor included, steel included.
And that is the path to cheap, abundant energy and fast rising living standards around the world, which of course is everyone's ultimate aim, right?
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much. Nick, anything else you want to add?
I'll say this. China have built 37 1-gigawatt reactors since Fukushima. They're building 150 reactors over the next decade. Now, that is effectively, their demand is to create 200 gigawatts, which is 12 Beijings of power. So I think when we look at what the UK is doing and contextualize it, it's the command economies that are really, really going to drive this further forward, because they are building at a rate that we can't even conceptualize.
Yeah, and we should start thinking more about that. Thank you. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Jake. Very, very kind of you both to join us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, before we go, as you know, here on Merryn Talks Money, we like to leave you with a takeaway or two. So I know that after all this discussion about uranium mining and nuclear power, you will want to know how you can invest. Now, obviously, this is not investment advice or anything remotely like that, but we just wanted to let you know roughly where you can look. There are a couple of investment trusts in the space. There's Yellowcake and there's Geiger Counter. Yellowcake actually holds physical uranium oxide concentrate. Geiger Counter invests in exploration, development, production companies in the sector. You can also look at the ETFs. There are quite a few of these. There's the Sprott Uranium Miners ETF and there's the Global X Uranium ETF. That's just a couple. There are several more. And the performance of everything that I just mentioned should, of course, be pretty closely linked to the uranium price. Thanks for listening to this week's Merryn Talks Money. If you like our show, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And keep sending questions or comments to merrynmoney@bloomberg.net. You can also follow me and John on Twitter or X. I'm Merryn SW, and John is John_Stepek. This episode was hosted by me, Merryn Somerset Webb. It was produced by Samasadi, Moses Andam, and Tala Ahmadi. Sound design by Blake Naples. Special thanks to Jake and to Nick.